All right. Hello, everyone. And let's just jump right into kicking off our Rich Text Editor issue refinement
We are
and
gonna be
iteration planning.
that's right for the Rich Text Editor.
Yep.
So Eric, you posed some questions about this topic. First, you asked like, what do we need to do first? So I was like collecting some of the tasks that I think that we could start with. I know that one of the goals that we have is to make the development of this editor to develop it in parallel, right? Like several people can work on this. I think that we have to go through a first step of creating an scaffold for the project. One of the goals that I think that that is important for us is also incentivizing the community contributions. So I think that perhaps what we have to do first is lay out that fundamental structure of how the editor will be organized, how each feature has to be implemented, set up the package dependencies, and then create, let's say, some patterns of how we can test each feature, write the documentation, start a development guideline that not only the editor team can follow, but also other teams. Finally, I think that we should, right now we have a Rich Text Editor component that is only used by the static site editor, that is based on Toast UI, and it's the one that we have to deprecate, and we want to deprecate. So I think that we could do some cleanup in there, and take that Toast UI based editor and move it inside the static site editor application, because it's only going to be used in that app until we replace it as well.
So that's what I was missing. This proposal is to build something completely new. In addition to that, I get it. Okay.
Yes, because otherwise, if we try to replace Toast UI, the editor that is used by static site editor, then we need to build the entire component with all of the features that Toast UI already supports. So we won't be able to make a release of that editor until we can reach that feature parity. And I don't think that we want that, right? We want to release something earlier. So any thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, just to agree. Yeah, we don't want to have to make this dependent on reaching feature parity with the static site editor for our MVC. So I think starting a fresh component makes the most sense here. And I just added a section in the agenda just for my own note taking about like epics or issues that need to be created just to track some of this work. So feel free to continue to add to that, but a couple things that we might want to create now but track much later, like an official deprecation of Toast UI when we do get to feature parity and we want to remove it from the code base. Maybe people out there that for some reason have forked or have a dependency or are used to working on that will probably need a formal deprecation, even though it's not an API.
No, it's yeah, we can discuss it later. I'm gonna share my screen because my next points can benefit from doing that. So in relation to the smallest thing that we could ship, I was looking at the Wiki editor. Sorry, I think I should go to a project. Okay, I'm gonna open the wiki elsewhere.
I mean, like one intercepting question is for you. Like if we talk about Rich Text Editor, and if I look at the MVC points like bold and italic and this kind of stuff, regarding vision, like what do we talk about here? Do we kind of envision something like I mark it and click a button and highlight it or so, or do we actually kind of really look for kind of like this Notion-like experience? Because I'm still not getting out of the proposal. So if we are on this very interactive way, or is this more like, okay, like copy paste a Word style approach?
So I touched that point here. So when we implement a feature like as simple as setting text as bold, we can allow the user to introduce bold text in several ways. So one of the ways is setting an input row. That would be like you start like using your markdown syntax in the Rich Text Editor, and then it convert that piece of text in bold. So I'm thinking that we could organize shipping those features like in that way. Like we don't see it in isolation as, okay, we added a bold button in the toolbar that allows you to set the text as bold. But we treat bold as, if we are implementing bold, we have to take care of configuring an input row that allows you to have that Notion-like experience. We define the UI component to click in the toolbar, but we also have to take care of defining other aspects like the paste rules. Like you want to paste markdown, and then it will convert to it will be properly displayed in the Rich Text Editor or even HTML. This is something that TipTap and ProseMirror already provides a lot of help with. Like all of these features are already set up in TipTap for the bold styling. But yeah, I think that from the ground up, we have to think in which kind of experience we want to provide, and try to implement each of the features in the editor, considering all of those aspects.
Okay, that makes sense. And sounds good.
Should we also consider? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So I have some. I'm confused about exactly what it is going to entail technically, and we don't have to get off into the weeds here, but like the previous approach and what we talked about with TipTap and ProseMirror is like it's client-side rendering Markdown, right? So it's live. So when you say we're still going to rely on server-side parsing, how do those two fit together? Are we only going to like ship out parts of it, like the MR links, or what?
ProseMirror, the way that ProseMirror works is that you pass an input that can be in either HTML or Markdown, and then ProseMirror will convert that raw content into a ProseMirror document that is like a domain model that they have to represent a document. So the idea is that
That's a cliffhanger.
Switch to a preview mode. Well, that's not proper Markdown.
You cut out for a minute there. You said the idea is that, and then you froze.
Okay, let me see. Sorry. So what I was saying is that when you switch between the write and preview modes here, we rely on the server on the Markdown endpoint in the server to parse the Markdown and create an HTML output. That's supporting that HTML that is produced by the server is way easier than parsing the Markdown in the client, because ProseMirror has better support for HTML than for Markdown. So we only have to set up ProseMirror to take this HTML that is produced by the server, parse it and convert it into a ProseMirror document, which shouldn't be very complicated because we only have to account for the differences that ProseMirror is expecting in the way that we represent bold text or a link or a task list, etc.
So we're not going to support live editing of the rich text? It's always going to be like the raw Markdown like this? like the right tab is raw markdown? Because what I'm getting at is if we want to support live editing of the rich text, like the latency to the server is what how can that ever be fast enough real time?
We are not going back to a server with every time that the user introduce some new content. So when the user is introducing content in the editor, we are producing the HTML in the client. And then when we go back to the write mode, let's say, and we want to display the markdown based on the content in the rich text editor, we have to generate that markdown in the client as well.
So what if they do something like writing an MR or issue link on the fly, something that has to be rendered by the server, but they're doing that while they're editing the rich text? Like how does that work?
How would you write that MR? Like just putting a link
well, like
there?
Now, if, for example, if you put a colon or you put, a hash or something, it will like start and you type that in, it will automatically give you the link to the issue or the MR. But like that is sort of server-side dependent.
It is not server-side dependent. So this is the way that the autocomplete the suggestions function work in the editor is that there is a drop-down component that makes an API call to get all of the suggestions from the server. But the part of generating the link in the client is done in the client. It's not done in the server.
Okay, maybe that's a bad example, but I assume there's something that is dependent upon the server rendering, or we don't have to get into it, but it seems like I'm still confused about why would we have to have the server render anything if we have all of the logic on the client? And if we don't have all of the logic on the client, how are we going to render everything live?
Okay, perhaps we can keep discussing that question.
Sure, let's follow up.
Other context.
I think it is important to specify and underline that for our MVC, we will be relying on server-side rendering of the markdown and not fully like building that architecture that we had been proposing before, where we had a client-side markdown parsing. And part of that is because we already have an existing server-side markdown parser that handles all of GitLab flavor markdown already. And there's no reason to completely rewrite that for our MVC.
Yeah, probably I'm having a difficult time explaining the entire workflow, how that works, but I don't know, perhaps I can open an issue or point out to the architecture document where I create documentation for that.
Yeah, I can comment a little bit about how Prose Mirror can handle these things. Like, for example, you're working on something, some document that is not marked down on the front end, and then you send it over to the server side, and server side sends you a different markdown, and then you convert that back to HTML. And Prose Mirror can actually do a diff of what has changed, so that it can, for example, convert a short code of a merge request or an issue into an actual link. So we can do a lot of things like that. Like we can also do like live collaboration using something like that. Like two people are collaborating with each other. So if you consider that scenario, like consider the server as some other user who is collaborating with you. So like the GitLab Markdown server, Markdown rendering is just someone else editing the document at the same time. So Prose Mirror can quite easily do that. So
yeah, I still have questions, but we need to take it offline. It's about like latency and what is the source of truth for rendering it.
Yeah, it's a long conversation. Yeah, I have done something like this before. So and it has a couple of issues with it, but yeah, that. But I agree that should not be like maybe we can do it as a step two. Not
let's continue with like the product-wise implementation plan and how we want to kind of move forward with Rich Text Editor itself as a product.
Cool. So next question is, what is the smallest thing that we can ship in the wiki? So I opened the Wiki editor because I wanted to display this toolbar that is like I think that the minimum amount of functionality that the wiki provides. I was wondering if we could ship an editor with all of these features except tables, because it's complicated to implement, and then provide that editing experience as an optional one in the wiki. And the only downside that I see with that approach is that if a user tries to open a document, a wiki page that is using features that are not, that is not one of them or one of these, then the editor won't be capable of opening of editing the page. So perhaps what we can do is like not allowing to enable that editing experience if we detect that kind of those unsupported content in the page that the user wants to edit.
Those are a couple interesting compromises. I want to talk through each one. The first being tables. That makes me feel uncomfortable, not necessarily saying no to that as an MVC, but I guess I'd like to think more about how that would impact the ability for users to try out and be successful with our MVC, and how long we would put that off for. Like if it meant one release and then we just focus on tables, like we could probably talk about that, but maybe we could talk a little more about what makes tables more complex and how we would address that, even if it's not in the MVC.
Well, I'm thinking in terms of how long it takes to implement the visual components, because tables require a custom editor that is like in line to a table. Let's say that I insert a table here, and then I want to add another column or another row. So we have to implement all of these components. We already have some tools provided by Pros Meters to handle tables. So we will be good on that side, but it will require more time than just adding like the functionality of setting text as bold or creating a list. I think in those terms, like from the point of view of thinking that an MVC is something that we want to release, in the short term.
It makes a lot of sense. Would we be able to render tables that, and this is to your second point, would we be able to render tables and allow the text inside a table to be edited without providing the formatting for adding new rows and removing rows and things like that? Maybe we could still display the content in the editor?
No.
Because then, yeah, we do have the problem of that we ran into a lot on the static site editor, which is like we have content on the page that the editor doesn't understand, and we either need to separate that from the editable content in some way, or prevent the editor from even loading in the first place, which given at least our internal use of wikis and a recent conversation I had actually yesterday with another heavy user, a customer that uses wikis heavily, tables are a big part of it. But clearly it's a separate effort. I mean, it's a feature that can be implemented in isolation. So we can talk more about whether or not that makes it into our first release or at what point we make it available to everybody. But it's an important thing for me to remember, the complexity of tables as far as including it in the MVC.
So if I understand it correctly, like one thing we could probably do with the MVC is like we just say, okay, if there's a table, we just don't render it in this case, and you just see like the markdown version of it. That would work, right? They're just like, we don't do anything with it. Like we don't do any special rules. Like if there's like just in the rich text area, if like somebody writes a markdown style table, okay, then you see it like as plain text or so, only kind of in the full rendered version. So if like we submit anything, that's where you see it. Would that be possible? Because at least then we don't kind of lose the support for tables.
I don't know. Himanshu, do you have any experience with that? I haven't tested the idea of sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think we can. So ProseMirror supports this thing, these schemas. So we just need to. I'm quite out of date with what ProseMirror supports these days, but back in the day, there used to be like you could just tell ProseMirror that these are the schemas that I support. So if your backend, if your document contains those tags, so like it can render it properly, even though like you might not be able to edit those, but you can at least display those. I think it should be possible, but I'm not sure.
So I think there's got it.
Sorry, yeah, I have used ProseMirror to display tables in the past, but that was like 3 or 4 years ago.
So
Yeah.
the general case is just like we had for the static site editor. For things we don't support, you have to do something with that in the rich text editor. So you either, which means you have to somehow fence it off, and either it's like a rendered but not editable version that you can't touch, or you just don't show it. But some way you have to fence. And that's going to be true of, sort of to my previous point, of every feature that we don't support rendering on the client, but is supported by the GitLab flavored markdown on the back end.
That's right. Like every feature supported by GFM, we have to ask the same question. If we provide some sort of support at least to display that content.
So that's what I was getting at. Like until we achieve that 100% parity with the server-side rendering and the client-side rendering, there's going to be this two sources of truth, and we have to deal with that inconsistency somehow, that they can't edit this or we can't show it or something.
And as Enrique and Chad will attest, we've spent a long time talking about this and trying different approaches for how to handle sort of mixed content in a page or unsupported content, and with varying levels of success and stability. I would say I'm nervous about showing the raw markdown in the editor as plain text, because then I don't know, in my experience, and maybe ProseMirror handles this better, but it seems like we risk like that getting translated into text, and it breaks, it turns into a paragraph instead of markdown, right? And then the idea, if we can't render the table without making it editable, then I would probably prefer from an experience standpoint to have some kind of call out that just says like there's content on the page we don't understand and click here to edit the source or something like that. And like maybe we can even know that it's a table and say like tables aren't supported in this version, like click on this issue to follow our progress, right? We can be very transparent about what we support and what we don't support for the MVC, especially when it comes to things that we know we don't support, right? Like there's the wiki, the reason we're choosing it is because there's a fairly well-defined set of things that you can type in there. And the static site editor would have a lot more of these edge cases.
Yeah, so I think that we should explore Himanshu's idea about just creating a prose mirror schema that knows how to interpret all of the features supported by the GitLab flavor Markdown. Even though we don't provide tools to edit it, perhaps we can teach Prose Mirror how to read it and display it. And I think that it should be really easy because it's just defining a parse-down function that tells you, hey, this HTML picks those attributes and display it in a specific way. What is gonna be a bit more expensive is defining how to translate that HTML back to Markdown. But it shouldn't be also like, well, it's gonna be an accumulated cost based on all of the features that you can use in the wiki. But seeing each feature in isolation is it doesn't represent a significant cost.
So just to replay, just to make sure I fully understand, which this is great, and this is what we need to be talking about. We could separate the concerns. For our MVC, we can build a schema that interprets everything that's available in GitLab Flavor Markdown, everything that could potentially be put into a wiki or in an existing wiki page, so that at least we understand the content coming in, and then the editor, as we build out individual features, can make those components in the schema editable. So for example, if we decide that the MVC, in order to get it out as soon as possible, doesn't support editing tables and you can't type ahead labels or something like that, like we can find this list of things to make the cutoff, but at least then the content is rendered, and we may be even able to direct the user to like switch over to the raw Markdown source to make their edits.
That's right.
Okay, cool.
So the
I
content
like
would be rendered but read-only. Like you can say this part of this element of a prose mirror schema, like a table, is like rendered but not editable. Because I still don't see how we would do it.
No, it's gonna be possible to edit the text nodes within an element that is not supported. For example, you have this elements tree, this hierarchy of nodes, where a table cell contains a text node. So you can edit the text node within the table, but you cannot make any special, edits like adding a new row to the table, or if you have another complex component like a reference to a user or a merge request, you cannot like edit that complex component in itself, but you can edit the text within it.
Okay.
I mean, that seems like a good compromise to me for an MVC, which is that an existing table in a wiki gets translated appropriately and displayed and previewed, and if I need to change the content of the cell, then I'm good. If I want to change the format of the table, we say, look, sorry, it's coming later, right? We'll indicate to the user that we're working on that, and we'll be okay.
Cool. So any other thoughts about how we could define the MVC and what it should contain?
So yeah, I mean, I've been taking notes. I think what we want to do, we need to define the experience, and obviously this comes with Prose Mirror, but I think as we, or with TipTap, as we move towards it, what we want to do is use the floating medium style formatting bar. So that's the experience we're going for. I believe, though I'm saying that, and Michael's mockups for what it looks like in Wiki had a top toolbar. So I want to chat with him about whether or not he was doing that because he just felt like it would be less disruptive, or if he thinks that's the best experience. I know in TipTap you can have either one, so we'll just decide on a direction. We don't want to have both, or like make that some kind of user setting. We don't want to introduce any confusion. So I guess my question would be, is one take less time to implement than the other in TipTap, or we just have to pick a direction?
I think we have to choose a direction. TipTap provides renderless components, which means that it doesn't provide the user interface from from the beginning. So it's gonna be a similar effort.
Okay. Well, we'll get clarity on that obviously before we start building. Then where did my notes go? I was trying to write that to Michael. Here we go. We want to build in a mechanism to opt in to this MVC and opt back out. That's part of the MVC, right? We need to have a way for the user to try this out. We're going to build all the basic text formatting features, but maybe not editing every aspect of GitLab flavored Markdown. And we'll come up with that final list. We don't need to do that in a synchronous manner. But a schema to support all GitLab flavored Markdown content. And then one question I wanted to raise is this an opportunity to use Editor Lite for the source editing, or should we introduce this as another tab in the existing bar, right? Like, I guess to step back, if you think about the Wiki editing view, we have that content box. If opting into the new editor simply adds a new tab up there, and it's now called Rich Text, and you can switch between source and preview and Rich Text or whatever, or maybe we hide preview. That's one approach. Would it be too much for the MVC to introduce that source editing as Editor Lite?
The source editing doesn't use Editor Lite right now.
So, I mean, I guess that's the answer, is it's probably too much moving parts to deal with that as part of the MVC.
Yeah, so you mean you want to use Editor Lite there so that we can get syntax highlighting for Markdown as there, right?
Right, and just consistency. Would it be an opportunity to introduce that?
Yeah, I mean it's possible, but it's a tangential effort. I mean, it doesn't have to block working on this MVC.
So I want to point out that Michael's mockups of what the opt-in look like are, if you click through to the issue that he linked, that one, yeah, and then if you click, yeah, go down to the highlighted, yeah, so there's no multiple tabs. It's like the rich text editing is the only experience you have. So the incremental approach we were just discussing, where some things just don't work, isn't really compatible with that, at least not until we have full feature parity. Yeah,
I think that's the 2 points of feedback I have on this. And we just opened this up as the meeting was starting, so there's time to refine this. But the 2 points of feedback I have for him are, we need to have a way to drop back into the raw source, and we want to make sure that the top toolbar is the direction we want to head in. I was under the assumption we were going to go with the sort of floating on every line kind of medium-like editing experience.
Okay.
Okay. Should we move on to the next issue then? So to the next question. Anissa about what components are involved: Markdown parser, Rich Text Editor, server-side or client-side parser. So we touched this point previously, but the idea is that we won't involve Markdown parsing in the client on this iteration, and probably we don't ever need to involve Markdown parsing in the context of a wiki or any features that supports Markdown flavor, GitLab flavor Markdown, because that parsing and rendering is already supported in the server.
But yeah, you would need to do that if someone wants to edit the source.
Why?
Yeah, you're right. You can just get the mark. Like if you're getting the HTML from the server, like if you're not dealing with Markdown or in the Rich Text Editor at all, how do you get? I'm not sure how Markdown like do you like take the original document in Markdown and then convert it to HTML, and I'm not really sure how that works.
Okay, so we have to deal with Markdown, but we don't have to parse it. We have to generate it. So we can edit the HTML generated by the server. But once you switch from the rich text to the raw mode, we have to take that HTML and convert it into Markdown.
Right.
But that still doesn't require a Markdown parser, and I think that's very advantageous.
And I'm getting to understand it now, but so the part that concerns me is that inverse operation when you convert it back to Markdown. Like if our rich text editor does not have like 100% parity with rendering exactly the same as the GitLab flavored Markdown on the back end, they have to be in sync. Otherwise, what they saw in the rich text editor is not what they're going to see when they save it or when they look at it somewhere else.
That's right. Like if the user writes some Markdown in the raw mode, and then we allow the server to generate HTML for that, and then when the user switches from rich text to raw Markdown, we are going to be generating Markdown that is potentially different from what the user wrote in the first place. Just like a similar problem to what we had in Toast UI.
Yeah. So that's the edge cases that really worry me. Like, and especially like they write something that is not well formatted. Like presumably that should be impossible in the rich text editor, but like they write something that it just doesn't understand and it happens to render differently or get saved differently.
Yeah, like
it seems like an area of risk is all I'm doing is calling it out to get that exact parity on both sides and keep that maintained, as GitLab flavor, Markdown, and this editor have to evolve completely in sync always.
That's right. But at the end, both editors are adhering to a standard, right? To common mark.
Right. I mean, I envision like some golden master test where we have every possible thing and we render them with both, and the build will fail if they don't match identically down to the character on the rendered HTML.
Yeah, but there is something that there is a distinction that I think that is worth highlighting, that the editor is not rendering Markdown. It's not rendering HTML. It's generating Markdown, and then the server is doing the opposite. It's like taking Markdown and generating HTML. So there shouldn't be like well, we will be like comparing two operations that are doing exactly the opposite thing. Doesn't that make sense?
Yes, but the server is rendering, it renders Markdown, but Prosemirror, whatever it does to render its HTML as they type it live, that HTML has to exactly match what would be rendered by that.
Yeah.
Like if you take the inverse operation of the HTML from the Rich Text Editor and then rerun it through the GitLab flavored Markdown, those have to be identical always for any possible thing that could have been written. Right?
That is right.
No, they cannot really be identical always, because obviously you would, like, for example, tag some user and it converts into a link. So what TipTap or the collaborative editing thing can do here is that if there is a difference, it applies the server-side changes to your document, like calculates a diff and then applies it to the document. We'll need to do a little bit more research, but I
Like
think it
real
should
time?
be quite, yes, real time.
Right, but the end result of that is that the two HTMLs should be completely identical after
Yes,
all of the processing is done.
yes. After that, they will be identical. Yes.
Okay. Probably should have written a note about this.
I get it now. I wasn't at the beginning, but I understand how it's going to work. A flow, like a sequence diagram, or would have helped, or something like that. Yeah. I'm going to say like displays / renders there. Whatever that means for Prosemirror.
Thank you, Shad. Okay, next point is can anything be done in parallel? I think that is a feature that we can really develop in parallel, because I know that perhaps like let's like bringing one example is that in the case of the schema, we have to develop a schema that supports 2 features of GitLab Flavor Markdown. We can have, like someone defining that schema for one feature and someone else doing it for another feature. Perhaps we have to do some initial scaffolding. We could even also split that and organize it. But at some point, it should be like there should be a very easy way of seeing like 2 features, like 2 paths of development.
Yeah, that's great. I would also just like to know our presumption of the split between back end and front end. I mean, obviously this seems very, very heavily skewed to front end. Is there going to be any back end support?
The one part I had, like, related to what Himanshu was saying, like for example, the issue links or the drop downs, like all that information is retrieved up front, and nothing has to be like an asynchronous request in the back end to get new stuff rendered.
Could you repeat that question?
So for example, the completing an issue, right? Like you type a hash and it gives you a drop down of the list of issues, right? Is that's going to be a real-time request to the server,
Yes.
right? And so there's nothing that we're going to have to like ask the server again after it's already rendered the initial HTML. From then on, it's all client.
Only if the user goes back to the raw mode, made some edits and go back to the rich text mode, then we are going back to the markdown endpoint to re-render the markdown in the server.
Right. So that's what I'm getting at. So presumably all of that support already exists on the server. Those endpoints are already there. The endpoint to get the data for the drop-downs as well as to render HTML.
That's right. Like we are using all of those features in the issue description editor and the notes. So Himanshu, what is the scope of this view conversion of the wikis?
It's actually quite similar to snippets, just a little bit lesser maybe. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going around in wikis. Like you can, there's wiki pages, there's a list of pages, and there's a wiki display page, and then you can edit the wiki page. Like there are like 4 or 5 different pages. So
Himanshu, like I would not aim for like any kind of else besides the wiki edit experience for the MVC. Like I think that's all we need or so is still like create a page, you click edit and you come on this specific like edit page. I don't think we need to refactor all of like wiki for just like supporting a rich text. Just one page maybe.
Yeah, just the wiki edit page, then we can just convert that to view, and then all of the other pages can stay in normal HAML and Ruby.
Is there currently spam protection for Wiki? I think there's not, right?
No.
Luckily, we have the DRI for spam in our team.
It would be easy to add it now if there was.
Also, I had a question, like, for example, like Chad mentioned that you, for an example where you put an issue number and then there's a dropdown that appears. Let's say I don't select anything in the dropdown and I just enter an issue number and I hit spacebar in the Rich Text Editor. What's going to happen next? Like, will a request to the server be sent here and to convert that thing into, so let's say, a link?
Yes. So the way that I've been experimenting a lot with the suggestions, quiz suggestions in Proxmirror and TipTap, because I know that that's going to be the most difficult feature that we're going to have to implement when we try to bring the rich text editing experience to issue description and notes. And the way that could happen is that you type or you paste just, a reference, the bank character and the number of the issue. What Proxmirror would do is like to interpret that as a specific node that we teach Proxmirror how to recognize. Like, if you see these two characters together, that represents a reference to an issue. And then based on that, some logic outside of the display logic of Proxmirror can take that node and find for that reference in the server.
Okay, so my question mainly was like, what data do you send to the server? Do you send the entire document, or do you just send that particular like snippet, I would say, of the hash?
That particular piece of data.
Okay.
Not the entire thing.
And it also has to parse for URLs which match the pattern for auto-rendering to issues or epics or MRs, right? Because those get shortened down.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's like if you want to recognize a you have to parse that, right? That piece of data and recognize that it's a specific type of node within the tree.
And Prosemera can do that. It's like got the capability to say, all right, I'm gonna look at URLs, but only URLs which match this particular host and path or whatever.
Exactly. So in relation to backend support, I feel that for the MVC, we don't need backend involvement, but that's an estimation. I can't say like I'm 100% confident of that. But I think that backend involvement will be required when we start like displaying advanced features like PDF files and diagrams, because if you like have a PDF attachment, you probably want to teach the Markdown endpoint to represent that PDF attachment as a special note with metadata about how we should display that PDF file in the editor. So that's something that we want to work on regardless of the Rich Text Editor, right? Because we want to display PDFs in line in the wiki.
So the auto suggestion endpoints, those are already all exposed via the API? They're not?
That's right.
GraphQL and REST?
I don't know. I don't know if GraphQL,
Okay.
but I know that the suggestions component is implemented using REST APIs.
Okay.
Cool. So next point is the deployment strategy. I think that perhaps Eric, you could explore and provide some thoughts in relation to the proposals that Michael shared with us in the issue. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing we need to define is at what point we expose this as an opt-in to users versus like it's behind a feature flag. So okay, so taking a step back, I think there's three phases to this. We have a component, it's live, but it's behind a feature flag, and maybe we only turn it on for us. Then there's a default visible toggle to opt in, and then there's default on, that this is the default experience for editing wiki text, right? So defining those milestones and what needs to go into place to set those up, obviously we need to create the feature flag for it. We need to find a place in the UI to toggle that switch back and forth, and make sure that toggling the switch back and forth doesn't actually break anything, right? Like if we're formatting things, and we want to, hopefully, because we're talking about all this consistency with the Markdown source and the endpoint for server-side rendering of Markdown, there won't be any chance for discrepancies, but obviously we'd want to make sure reverting back to the old editor is seamless. If for some reason there's a feature we don't support, or it's not working right, or whatever, then we'll get to the point where we default to on probably, later this year. I'm not too concerned about that strategy right now. I think it's important probably to talk about the strategy also in the context of what's not in the MVC, which I made a note, and we haven't really talked about this, but since the wiki allows you to write in other formats other than Markdown, our MVC should be specifically for Markdown formatted pages. We can work towards ASCII doc support, RDoc support, and things like that. And I know there's a lot of issues in the backlog and a lot more context that I still am catching up on as far as like a strategy for making ASCII doc a little more first class and having it be a little more native feature. In an ideal world, if I understood all this correctly, we'd be able to build out a similar workflow with ASCII doc on the back end, so that the Rich Text Editor understands and outputs ASCII doc format instead of Markdown format someday, but that's not part of the MVC. So I think making sure in the UI, like it's very clear. This is just for Markdown pages. And for those that do support it, making it very easy to switch over and try out the new editor. So in relation to Michael's concepts, I actually really like the idea of getting rid of that Markdown is supported link and instead using that area to switch and toggle between the editors. The only thing that's missing, as we already talked about, is the way to get back to the source view. And since, I mean, I think it could be as simple as when you toggle that switch and opt into the new editor, you now have two tabs instead of write and preview. It's like source and rich text or something like that. And source is the same content as write. We just maybe change the name of the button or something like that to make it more clear. And the rich text editor becomes a replacement for the preview link. I'll leave a comment to that effect and let Michael define that experience. But that's my hope, is that it's that simple.
Okay, so Chad, you have the next point.
Yeah, I just put an update on it. I don't think this is really relevant. I wrote this when I was thinking we were going to continue iterating on the existing static site editor, rich text editor, but it's not relevant to this meeting, but it's still a thing. Like, if are we killing the editor or the whole static site product, or what's the long-term plans for that? Maybe it's a discussion for another day, probably. We're already running late here.
Yeah, I mean, we should have that discussion. There are no plans to completely, abandon that category. So if anything, I think we're building a stronger case for it by working on this rich text editor and hopefully make it a better product or a better category in the long term. But in the near future, yeah, it is. It's not something we're specifically investing in, solely features for the static site editor.
Right. There's still very different use cases too for the two
Yeah.
editors.
Okay, so Michael has the next point. I think these are mock-ups of what we want to achieve, I guess, eventually in the long term. Eric, I don't know if you have any notes or observations.
I don't think there's anything else that we haven't talked about. I think this is an interesting issue that we hadn't touched on, his North Star issue, which is like where it could look elsewhere. And I think the only thing I would want to point out here, these are obviously aspirational. These are things that are further down the road, not part of the MVC, like editing titles. So if you looked at the Wiki edit page right now, we have the title, the content type, I believe, and then the format, so Markdown, and then the content editor itself, and then there's like a commit message and a save button on the bottom. Our MVC is specifically constrained, I think, to that content editing block. Eventually, it'd be nice to like have some way to pull in that commit message and editing the title and switch formats even on the back end, although that's less relevant if you're using a rich text editor. And things like when you end up in the static site editor, there's going to be other things like front matter and editing, metadata on the page, things like that. So as an aspirational goal, this is fantastic, and I think that it's very close to what we're looking at. I am curious, and I want to talk to him. We'll probably we have our design UX sync. I'll put it as an agenda item to talk through this top toolbar versus like inline formatting, whether or not he thought this might be easier, or if he actually thinks this is like a preferred experience. So we'll talk through that. And otherwise, the only other topic that comes to mind looking at this would be something that we'll be very intentional about, and something that will behave a little more, it won't behave quite the same as something like Medium, which is that like in the wiki view and in issue view here, the idea being that you toggle between an edit mode and a read mode, right? So what I'm getting at is I don't see a near future where we're removing the need for an edit mode. We're not ever going to have like live editing, because ultimately it needs to result in a commit. So we need to be in an intentional editing experience where we're editing and then there's a save and a commit message. You know, that get right operation is committed, and we then switch back over to the read-only view. The closer those start to look, the more I expect the desire will be to like remove that barrier and just be able to like click into the description and start writing, and then click out of it and it saves. That's not something that we need to explore now. It may be something that's technically never possible because of the get operation that needs to happen, but that's something that came up in an issue that I saw yesterday, I think, around the wiki, and trying to remember the context, but it was effectively the same concern, which is like going into edit mode and creating the right operation versus editing in the live sort of read mode. And I'll try and find that issue and link it. I think what we're getting at is until we I'm not sure we can ever get away from having like entering an edit mode, right? I don't know. What do you think about that? That's not part of the MVC. We don't even need to estimate what it would take to do that. But that's something that's been in my head since yesterday when I saw it in an issue. And now I can't remember exactly what it was about, but it was something where like something on the wiki, it was confusing the difference between the rendered output in the read mode and the editing mode. It was checkboxes. We should talk about checkboxes at some point and how they weren't interactive, because every time you click one, it becomes a write operation. It's a commit. So I'll just wrap it up to say that interactive checkboxes in the read view of Wiki is not part of the MVC. We don't need to solve for that in our MVC, and we can talk about it later.
It's an interesting program, indeed. Okay, so that was the last point. We are a little bit over the hour, so I think that we are done here. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I will follow up and we'll start writing out some issues and epics, define the MVC, and start defining what that scaffolding looks like. And yeah, appreciate all the input. Thanks for everything, Enrique, Manchu, Chad. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah.